Hey guys, tonight we're going to climb gently into the clouds and settle into an age when dirigibles promise not speed, not efficiency, but the strange luxury of drifting through the sky at something like walking pace. You picture yourself stepping onto a floating salon, wicker chairs gleaming in the lantern light, brass fixtures polished until they glow, and above you, a vast gas-filled envelope waiting to lift you toward the stars. It sounds glamorous, but let's be honest, you probably won't survive this story without nodding off halfway, which is kind of the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see this sleepy little cruise stretch across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The mooring field stretches wide before you, ropes laid out like serpents, crewmen tugging and shouting in half-sung rhythms. The dirigible itself looms overhead, its canvas stretched taut, painted insignia catching the last blush of sunset. Lamps glow warmly along the gondola, and passengers shuffle nervously, trying to decide whether they're boarding a miracle of modern science or an oversized floating sausage. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, dirigibles, steerable balloons with engines and rudders, were being pitched as the next great frontier of luxury travel. Unlike airplanes, which were still shaky contraptions of wood and canvas, these airships offered wide cabins, observation windows, and the promise of safe, stately journeys. The catch? They rarely moved faster than a horse-drawn carriage, about 5 to 10 miles per hour in their earliest days. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some promotional posters bragged that passengers could enjoy a cigarette, read the paper, and stroll the gondola without even using their hair. Of course, this ignored the awkward fact that everyone was floating inside a giant bag of highly flammable hydrogen. But hey, why spoil the vibe with details? Historians still argue whether these airships were genuinely practical modes of travel or more theatrical novelties designed to dazzle investors and impress the public. Were they serious attempts at reshaping global transportation, or just very expensive parades in the sky? The debate continues, floating back and forth like the craft themselves. You shuffle across the gangway into the gondola. The wicker creaks pleasantly underfoot, the brass rails gleam, and the air smells faintly of varnish and lamp oil. Stewards in tidy uniforms usher you to a padded bench, offering a cup of bouillon as though you've just entered a private club. The engines cough once, twice, then settle into a steady thrum, barely more than the hum of a sewing machine. You feel the floor tilt slightly, the ropes fall away, and suddenly the ground drifts back. Paris, or Berlin, or maybe Lake Constance, it doesn't matter, shrinks beneath you. Here's your gentle joke. You glance at your neighbor, who clutches the armrest as though you're ascending to Mars. You lean over and whisper, "Relax. If we go any slower, we'll be overtaken by pedestrians." As the dirigible clears the rooftops, the last sunlight catches the gas bag, turning it golden, and the world below spreads out like a carpet. Roads twist into threads, villages shrink into toys, and fields roll into quilted squares. The gondola rocks slightly, and you sink back, realizing that for tonight, your peculiar luxury is to be carried through the sky at the pace of an evening stroll. You're floating now, cushioned by the evening air, and as the dirigible hums lazily forward you find yourself thinking back to how it all began, not here, with polished wicker and steward uniforms, but decades earlier, when the idea of steering anything lighter than air was still laughable. Balloons had already dazzled the public in the late 18th century, drifting wherever the wind pushed them, but those who climbed into the wicker baskets quickly discovered one inconvenient truth: you could go up and down, but you couldn't really go anywhere. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The very first balloon flight in Paris, 1783, thrilled the crowd but exposed the problem of navigation. For nearly a century afterward, aeronauts bobbed helplessly, at the mercy of breezes. It wasn't until Henri Giffard's 1852 steam-powered airship that anyone managed a controlled flight, lumbering along at about 6 miles per hour. It was noisy, smoky, and only slightly more dignified than being dragged by a mule, but it proved that dirigibles, the steerable ones, were possible. You lean against the gondola's window as a fellow passenger recalls these early contraptions. He chuckles at the memory of Gifford's cigar-shaped balloon chugging through the sky, trailing coal smoke like an airborne train that forgot the tracks. Still, it was progress, an engine, a rudder, and crucially, the promise that humans could finally choose a direction. Here's the quirky tidbit. One early experimenter tried to row his balloon through the sky using giant oars. Spectators reported the result was about as effective as rowing on dry land. Another inventive soul fastened flapping wings to his craft, convinced that imitating birds would solve the problem. His balloon lurched like a drunken goose before drifting politely into a farmer's field. You can't help but smile. Humanity has always had a talent for comedy on the road to discovery. Historians still argue whether these early dirigibles were genuine breakthroughs or little more than publicity stunts. Were inventors like Gifford practical engineers, or showmen in pursuit of investors and applause? Some hail them as pioneers who paved the way for Zeppelin's empire. Others dismiss their machines as glorious oddities, floating footnotes in history. You watch the stars prick the darkening sky above you and think, maybe both. The sensory world of those first dirigibles comes alive in your imagination. Steam hisses, engines clank, and the air smells of coal smoke mixed with the faintly sweet tang of varnished silk. The gondola rattles under strain, ropes creak like old bones, and every gust of wind feels like a test of nerves. Passengers clutch wicker seats as the craft lurches, then laugh with the exhilaration of simply moving, however slowly, in the direction intended. Here's your gentle joke. You imagine an early passenger scribbling a postcard. We are traveling at the speed of a tired donkey. Please do not wait supper on us. As your modern dirigible drifts smoothly above a quilt of fields and villages, you feel a quiet gratitude for those chaotic beginnings. Without the dreamers who rode through thin air and flapped like geese, you wouldn't be here sipping bouillon in the clouds. The gondola hums forward, steady as a carriage, carrying you further into the strange promise of walking speed luxury. You ease back in your wicker seat, the hum of the small engines as steady as a heartbeat, and glance around the gondola. It's not just a vessel, it's a salon with windows. Brass fixtures glint, varnished wood gleams, and wicker chairs creak politely as passengers shift to catch the view. The dirigible is slow, but that slowness invites rituals, routines, and even a kind of airborne etiquette. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century and into the early 20th, dirigible gondolas were designed not as bare-bones cabins but as social spaces. Passengers were encouraged to dress as if attending an evening at a cafe, suits, gowns, and gloves. The idea was to present air travel as civilized leisure, not reckless adventure. Walking across the gently swaying floorboards, you were meant to feel like a guest in an upscale drawing room that just happened to be dangling beneath a giant hydrogen balloon. You glance to your left where a gentleman carefully balances a teacup as though he's at the Ritz, not hundreds of feet above farmland. Across from him, a woman arranges her skirts and adjusts her hat so that the plume doesn't brush the brass ceiling lamp. Conversation hums softly, like the engines, punctuated now and then by the steward's quiet offer of bouillon or pastries. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some airships even issued etiquette guides, gently reminding passengers not to lean too heavily against the windows, not to throw objects overboard, however tempting it might be to drop a letter straight onto Aunt Sophie's farm, and to keep their voices decorous, because sound carried oddly in the thin air. One bemused journalist noted that gossip in the gondola could be heard more clearly by the crew clinging to the rigging than by the person seated beside you. Historians still argue whether this etiquette was about safety or image. Did the rules genuinely protect passengers in fragile flying salons? Or were they more about convincing the public that dirigibles were refined rather than risky? Some scholars see this as clever marketing, others insist it was practical necessity. You sit back, listening to the low murmur of polite chatter, and decide it was probably both. The sensory details surround you, the faint vibration in the wicker beneath your fingers, the gentle sway that makes each teacup ripple, the smell of oil mixed with faint cologne and pastry. Outside, fields slip by with dreamlike slowness, the speed so unhurried you feel as though you could step out and walk alongside. Inside, however, everyone performs the careful choreography of elegance at altitude. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one poor fellow sneezing too loudly, breaking the hush, and immediately being eyed as if he'd committed a social crime worse than dropping hydrogen on the floorboards. As the gondola drifts on, you notice how this peculiar etiquette transforms the cabin. It's not just transportation, it's theater. Everyone plays their part, the captain serious, the steward gracious, the passengers serene. You sip your bouillon, straighten your coat, and let the performance carry you further, suspended in the clouds like an airborne cafe where time itself has agreed to slow down. The gondola's polite murmur fades for a moment as you follow a steward through a hatch into the quieter, stranger world above and around the cabin, the guts of the airship itself. Here the glamour peels away, and you're confronted with raw material, taut fabric, and the unmistakable smell of gas. Luxury may be what the passengers see, but engineering is what actually keeps the floating salon aloft. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Dirigibles were essentially enormous frameworks of girders and envelopes, holding multiple gas cells filled with hydrogen or coal gas. These gas bags were made of varnished silk or cotton, later treated with special solutions to slow leaks. Engineers inspected them constantly, testing seams, checking pressure, and tightening the latticework of the hull. Without this maintenance, a tiny puncture could turn the promise of leisurely flight into an unplanned and very rapid descent. You picture yourself brushing a hand against the stretched linen of one gas cell. It feels both delicate and sturdy, like a drumhead that hums faintly with each change of pressure. Workers carry lanterns with shaded glass, voices hushed, as though speaking too loudly might upset the fragile equilibrium. The brass valves hiss softly, expelling excess gas, and ropes creak where the great envelope shifts against the night breeze. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some early airship builders tried to plug leaks with slices of bread. The porous crumbs, pressed into a pinhole, would swell slightly and block the escaping hydrogen, for a few hours, at least. One mechanic swore by it, calling bread the sky's bandage. Imagine floating over France while your safety depends on yesterday's baguette. It's both ridiculous and, in a way, perfectly French. Historians still argue whether these frameworks represented cutting-edge precision or reckless improvisation. Were the gas bags marvels of engineering, or fragile balloons dressed up with girders? Some point to the remarkable distances these craft achieved. Others note the long list of accidents, and wonder if dirigibles were always one puff of wind away from disaster. You walk the narrow catwalk inside the hull, feeling both awe and unease, torn between miracle and folly. The sensory details are overwhelming here. The air smells faintly sweet from hydrogen leaks, mingled with varnish and oil. Fabric crackles faintly as it shifts, like the sound of sails on a ship. Each footstep on the catwalk sends a vibration through the thin framework, reminding you that the difference between sky and ground is measured in little more than stitched cloth and courage. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous passenger overhearing a mechanic talk about bread repairs and asking, "Does first class get croissants instead?" Stepping back down into the gondola, you feel the contrast more sharply than before. Passengers sip tea in polished wicker seats, oblivious to the fragile cathedral of fabric above their heads. Yet without the gas bags and girders, without the careful inspections and the absurd bread plugs, this salon would be nothing more than wicker on the ground. The peculiar promise of walking speed luxury floats entirely on invisible gas, stitched into silence by men who balance between ingenuity and improvisation. Back in the gondola, you settle into your wicker seat again, but now your ears tune more closely to the background hum. The engines, a pair of modest contraptions bolted to the sides of the framework, throb with the rhythm of a sewing machine rather than a locomotive. This is the heartbeat of your journey, steady but unhurried, and it tells you at once why dirigibles were both enchanting and slightly absurd. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The first generation of dirigibles often used small steam engines, later replaced by gasoline or diesel motors. These engines drove propellers that pushed the craft forward at speeds rarely faster than 10 to 15 miles per hour in the early years, eventually reaching 40 to 50 miles per hour in larger zeppelins. Compared with trains racing across Europe at 60 or more, or the later airplanes that could double that, dirigibles felt like floating carriages drifting in slow motion. You lean toward the window, watching a field of cows drift lazily beneath you. The funny thing is, you're barely overtaking them. The countryside slides by as if painted on a scroll that someone is cranking by hand. At this pace, you could jump out, stroll alongside, and clamber back in without missing much. Here's the quirky tidbit. One airship was once overtaken by a cyclist during a demonstration in the French countryside. The poor captain waved politely at the pedaling man, who rang his bell and zipped ahead, triumphant. Newspapers had a field day, printing headlines like, "The future of aviation, passed by a man on two wheels." Imagine the deflation, pun intended, of trying to sell investors on luxury travel while locals point out that bicycles are faster. Historians still argue whether the slowness was a flaw or a feature. Did the unhurried pace doom dirigibles to obsolescence, or was it precisely their appeal? Some scholars suggest the leisurely movement was intentional, sold as sky tourism, rather than speedy transport. Others dismiss it as a desperate excuse for engines that simply couldn't do better. You listen to the hum, steady as a lullaby, and think maybe both. The sensory details of the engine filled the gondola. You feel the faint vibration through wicker and wood, a tickle against your feet. A whiff of oil drifts in, blending with the perfume of a fellow passenger. The propellers beat the air in a slow, rhythmic chopping, like giant paddles in an invisible sea. The sound is not intrusive but oddly calming, like a mechanical lull that rocks you deeper into the dreamlike pace. Here's your gentle joke. You picture a captain boasting, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are traveling at walking speed." A passenger yawns, glances at his watch, and replies, "So is my grandmother, monsieur." But that, perhaps, is the charm. You're not hurtling, you're gliding. The slowness forces you to notice the curl of smoke from chimneys, the neat rows of vineyards, the glimmer of rivers threading through the countryside. You sip another cup of bouillon and realize that the engine's unambitious thrum is the lullaby of an era that believed travel wasn't about arrival, but about savoring every floating minute in between. The engines hum their lazy rhythm as the dirigible drifts onward, and you lean against the window, watching borders glide beneath you like faint pencil lines on a map. Unlike trains that stop for customs officers or ships that wait in harbors, you pass silently above hedgerows, villages, and rivers, as if slipping into someone else's story uninvited. Routes are not just drawn on timetables. They're painted across the entire continent. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the early 20th century, dirigible companies operated scheduled flights across Europe. German Zeppelins, in particular, connected spa towns, industrial centers, and capital cities, carrying passengers, freight, and mail. In 1910, the world's first airline, Deutsche Luftschiffahrtsgesellschaft, flew over 34,000 passengers on regular routes, boasting that its dirigibles made Europe feel smaller, even if they weren't very fast. You look down as the countryside shifts. One moment you're over tidy vineyards, the next forested hills, then suddenly, rooftops tiled in a different style, church steeples shaped with another tradition. Below, customs officers at border posts glance up and wave half-heartedly, powerless to stop the drifting salon above them. The dirigible ignores passports and stamps, its only authority the steady beat of propellers. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some passengers delighted in dropping postcards directly from the sky. Mailbags were occasionally tossed overboard, little parachutes guiding them down to waiting postmasters who stamped them with special airmail marks. Imagine a French farmer looking up to see a canvas sack floating gently into his field, only to find it stuffed with letters addressed to Berlin. You can almost hear him grumble, "The postman has grown wings." Historians still argue whether these routes truly revolutionized European travel or merely served a wealthy niche. Did dirigibles knit nations closer together, or were they more spectacle than substance, reserved for those who could afford bouillon in the clouds? Some point to their reliability compared to early airplanes, others note that trains remained cheaper, faster, and more practical for nearly everyone. The truth floats somewhere in between, like the airships themselves. The sensory details of these routes are dreamy. From the window, you see patchwork farmland unrolling beneath you, the smell of fresh bread wafting faintly from villages as the morning sun warms the earth. The dirigible tilts slightly as it follows a river valley, and you hear children below chasing its shadow, waving as though the sky itself had become a parade. In the gondola, passengers sip coffee, pointing at castles perched on cliffs, their voices soft so as not to disturb the floating quiet. Here's your gentle joke. You imagine a man riding home from a cross-border flight, bragging, "I crossed from Germany into France without showing a single paper." His wife replies, "Yes, dear, but you still forgot to bring the cheese." As evening drapes itself over the land, the dirigible presses forward, its lamps glowing softly against the darkening sky. From above, you watch borders blur and disappear, nations reduced to patterns of fields and towns. You realize the peculiar gift of this walking speed travel. It doesn't shrink distance, it lengthens time, giving you the rare luxury of lingering in the in-between. The countryside darkens beneath you, the last colors of evening dissolving into a wash of blue and gray. The gondola's lamps are lit, glowing warm against polished brass, but outside, the world is hushed and uncertain. This is the part of the voyage that feels most magical and most precarious: night navigation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Before sophisticated instruments, dirigible crews relied on compasses, maps, and star charts to guide them after sunset. Navigators crouched over oil lamps, measuring bearings with rulers while the helmsman adjusted rudders by hand. Powerful searchlights were mounted to sweep the ground, revealing rivers, fields, or landmarks below. It was all done with the patience of mariners, except here the sea was black air instead of water. You glance toward the forward cabin, where a helmsman steadies the wheel, his face illuminated by a dim lantern. A navigator spreads a chart, tapping with a pencil as he squints through a round window at Orion's belt. Another crewman tends the compass, careful to keep it away from the engine's stray vibrations. The routine is quiet, deliberate, like monks guarding ancient secrets, except their temple is a swaying gondola in the night sky. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some dirigible captains swore by carrying a small cage of pigeons, believing that if lost, releasing the birds would point them toward the nearest town lights. Others trusted the smell of coal smoke drifting from villages as a rough signal of civilization. Imagine plotting your course not with GPS but with a noseful of chimney soot or the wingbeat of a bird. Historians still argue whether these nighttime voyages were feats of precision or mostly luck. Did star charts and compasses truly keep dirigibles safe, or was it the forgiving slowness of the craft that allowed mistakes to be corrected before disaster struck? Some praised the navigator's skill, others shrugged that at walking speed, you had plenty of time to fix your errors. The sensory details of the night surround you now. Outside the window, the world is an ocean of shadow, dotted with the faint glimmer of lamps and villages far below. The hum of the engine seems louder in the silence, a steady lullaby against the dark. The smell of lamp oil mixes with the faint sharpness of ozone from the searchlight's spark. When the crew swings the beam across the ground, a farmhouse or river gleams for a moment before slipping back into blackness. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a nervous passenger leaning over to ask the captain, "How do you know where we are?" The captain points solemnly at the stars, then at the pigeons, then at the compass, before admitting, "Mostly, monsieur, we just hope we don't end up in Belgium by accident." As the dirigible drifts on, the gondola quiets. Passengers curl under blankets, lulled by the soft creak of ropes and the occasional call from the helm. Outside, constellations wheel slowly above, guiding the crew as faithfully as they once guided sailors. You sip the last of your bouillon, gaze at the stars through the glass, and realize that in this strange floating salon, you are not rushing anywhere. You are simply suspended between darkness and dawn, carried forward by trust in charts, compasses, and a little luck. The night stretches on, and while most passengers drift into drowsy silence, you notice a curious little bustle at the rear of the gondola. A steward unlocks a narrow door, and suddenly the hum of conversation shifts to the rustle of paper and the clatter of small crates. You lean closer and realize this dirigible isn't just a floating salon. It's also a flying post office. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Dirigibles often carried mail alongside passengers. Their steady routes and generous gondola space made them ideal for airborne postrooms, complete with clerks who sorted letters in midair. By the early 20th century, some airships boasted special airmail stamps and cancellation marks, proud proof that your message had traveled not by rail or ship, but literally through the clouds. You step closer, imagining the clerks hunched over cramped tables, sorting stacks of envelopes by lantern light. Newspapers rustle in bundles, advertisements flutter, and a steady flow of ink stamps mark each piece with the name of the dirigible. A small hatch opens, and sacks of outgoing mail are dropped down to waiting postal workers when the ship passes overhead. The routine feels at once practical and theatrical, letters falling from the sky like blessings. Here's the quirky tidbit: on some novelty flights, passengers could write postcards during the journey, hand them to the clerk, and have them parachuted down mid-route. Entire villages gathered in fields to catch falling mailbags, cheering as if gifts had been dropped by St. Nicholas. Imagine your aunt opening her door to find the morning's gossip literally delivered from the heavens. Historians still argue whether these airborne postrooms were primarily serious services or clever publicity stunts. Did they meaningfully speed communication, or were they mostly designed to dazzle the public and justify the dirigible's existence? Some point to reliable deliveries. Others dismiss the spectacle as more show than substance. You lean against the wall, listening to the flutter of envelopes, and think the truth probably drifts somewhere in between. The sensory details here are charming. Ink smells sharp in the tight space, blending with the wax of ceiling candles. The clerks' fingers are smudged black, their uniforms flecked with dust from paper sacks. The constant vibration of the engines makes each ink stamp wobble slightly, leaving charmingly imperfect marks. Every so often, a crate thuds as parcels shift, echoing like muffled drumbeats across the cabin. And here's your gentle joke. Picture a clerk handing a passenger a freshly stamped postcard and saying proudly, "You'll have the fastest mail in Europe." The passenger looks out the window, notices the cows still keeping pace below, and replies, "Fast is a generous word, monsieur." As dawn begins to pinken the horizon, the mailroom closes its hatch, the last bundles tucked away for delivery. You watch the steward lock the narrow door again, sealing the secret hive of paper and ink. The dirigible hums forward, not just a flying lounge but a sky-borne courier, carrying not only passengers but also the words, hopes, and jokes of thousands below. And as the light grows, you feel a peculiar comfort knowing that even in the clouds, the mail somehow still gets through. Morning light spreads soft and golden across the gondola as passengers stir awake. A steward in a crisp jacket appears with a tray of bouillon and rolls, moving as steadily as if he were in a hotel dining room rather than dangling beneath a massive balloon. You take a cup, sip the savory warmth, and realize the dirigible has shifted moods again. It isn't just transport, or post office, or salon. It's a floating hotel. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1910s and 1920s, larger dirigibles offered sleeping cabins, dining rooms, and even promenades. The German Graf Zeppelin, for instance, carried passengers on long voyages with cabins that could be converted from sofas to bunks, while stewards prepared meals in cramped galleys. The idea was to make the slow journey comfortable enough that travelers would prefer the steady leisure of airships to the jolting rush of trains or the cramped noise of airplanes. You wander into the small dining area, where wicker chairs are gathered around tables bolted to the floor. Porcelain cups clink gently as passengers exchange polite greetings. Through wide windows, the landscape slides beneath you with dreamlike slowness, farmland quilted in greens and golds, tiny trains puffing smoke in the distance. A waiter pours coffee, balancing expertly as the gondola sways, and sets down a plate of croissants with the air of a maitre d'. Here's the quirky tidbit. On some luxury flights, menus featured delicacies like consommé, pheasant, or chilled champagne. Newspapers marveled at the spectacle of passengers dining on silverware while dangling thousands of feet in the air. One journalist quipped that dirigibles offered the only restaurant where you might spill soup on Belgium while eating in Germany. You grin at the thought, steadying your own cup just in case. Historians still argue whether these floating hotels represented genuine progress in hospitality or were little more than advertising gimmicks to lure wealthy clientele. Did passengers truly enjoy restful sleep in thin-walled cabins vibrating with engines? Or was the romance exaggerated for brochures? Some describe peaceful nights rocked by the gentle sway. Others recall noise, chill, and the awkward knowledge that you were sleeping inches from a hydrogen-filled envelope. The sensory details make the illusion feel real. The cabin smells of fresh bread mingled with lamp oil, the floor vibrates faintly under your slippers, and curtains ripple softly in the draft from a cracked window. The steward's steps are quiet, deliberate, as he lays out linens in cabins, folding bunks down, fluffing pillows, adjusting lamps. Passengers move with the same rhythm, pacing the gondola as though stretching their legs on a veranda. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger waking up cranky and grumbling to the steward. "I couldn't sleep with all that humming." The steward smiles politely and replies, "Monsieur, if the humming stops, you will sleep forever." By nightfall, the dirigible has transformed completely. Tables cleared, curtains drawn, lamps dimmed to a golden hush. You climb into a narrow bunk, the linen surprisingly crisp, and feel the gondola rock as gently as a cradle. Outside, the stars shimmer, the engines purr, and Paris or Berlin or Vienna slides away unnoticed beneath the clouds. It is not fast, not efficient, not even entirely practical. But here in your floating hotel, it feels like a rare kind of peace, as if the world has slowed just enough to let you dream without hurry. The peaceful hum of the floating hotel doesn't last forever. By the second night, clouds have thickened, the gondola tilts uneasily, and the captain's voice carries down the corridor in short, clipped commands. You rise from your bunk, shuffle to the window, and see lightning flicker on the horizon, silent at first, then followed by the low growl of thunder. The passengers glance nervously at one another. Luxury has its limits when the sky decides to argue. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Dirigibles were notoriously vulnerable to weather. Their massive surfaces acted like sails, catching gusts that twisted them off course. Storms could batter the thin envelopes, lightning posed obvious danger to hydrogen, and strong winds often forced landings to be delayed or diverted. Safety drills became a necessary ritual on longer flights, rehearsed to soothe passengers as much as to prepare them. You watch the crew move quickly, shutters drawn tight, lamps dimmed, and stewards circulating with calm reassurances. The gondola rocks harder, wicker chairs sliding an inch before being wedged into place. A steward hands out safety belts, instructing passengers to fasten themselves to benches. You fumble with the strap, half amused that luxury travel requires the same indignity as riding a stubborn donkey. Hold on, and hope for the best. Here's the quirky tidbit. One airship company handed out small prayer cards during storms, printed with blessings for safe travel. Passengers collected them as souvenirs, some joking they were guaranteed lightning insurance. Others found humor in the absurdity. Fancy menus 1 hour, prayers the next. Imagine sipping champagne while clutching a holy card in the same hand. Historians still argue whether these safety practices were effective measures or mere theater. Did drills and belts actually prepare passengers for emergencies, or were they comfort rituals masking real fragility? Some accounts praise disciplined crews, others note that in truly violent storms, there was little anyone could do but trust luck. You grip the bench, swaying with the gondola, and wonder which side of the debate you'd prefer to believe. The sensory details of the storm are unshakable. Rain lashes the canvas envelope, drumming like an enormous hand tapping on the roof. The engines strain, their hum breaking into uneven roars. Lightning illuminates the interior for a split second, faces pale, brass gleaming too brightly, shadows jerking wildly, before plunging everything back into gloom. The gondola creaks, ropes groan, and you feel the peculiar shudder of a giant balloon flexing against the wind. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger whispering, "At least on trains you only worry about derailments." Another replies, "Yes, but on trains the rails don't float away in the wind." The nervous laughter that follows is thin but real. When the storm finally passes, the dirigible steadies itself once more, clouds thinning into ragged tatters. Lamps are turned up, bouillon is served again, and the captain strolls through the cabin as though nothing ever happened. Passengers laugh shakily, recounting their fears, and even the stewards crack tired smiles. You sink back into your seat, heart still racing but soothed by the return of the engine's steady lull. The peculiar promise of dirigibles, you realize, wasn't just luxury. It was the fragile glamour of daring to relax in a machine that could be undone by one bad gust, yet usually wasn't. Morning arrives clear and bright, the storm left far behind, and the dirigible now glides above unfamiliar terrain. Below stretch ochre sands, winding rivers, and patches of jungle so dense they look like green oceans. Passengers lean eagerly toward the windows, murmuring at the sight of landscapes they may never have seen otherwise. You sense a subtle shift in the narrative. This isn't just a European pleasure cruise anymore, it's an imperial itinerary. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the early 20th century, colonial powers envisioned dirigibles as tools to span empires. Plans were drawn for routes across Africa, India, and South America, linking metropoles to distant territories. German Zeppelins made demonstration flights over deserts and rainforests, pitching themselves as symbols of modern mastery over vast colonial spaces. Brochures promised that dirigibles would knit continents together in days instead of weeks. You press your forehead to the glass, watching the slow crawl of dunes beneath. A steward explains in hushed tones how the ship's long endurance, able to hover for days without needing a landing strip, was ideal for surveying or delivering supplies to remote outposts. A French passenger brags about the possibilities of mail drops over Algeria, while a British one nods approvingly about keeping the colonies orderly from the sky. The gondola buzzes with talk of empire, all framed as progress. Here's the quirky tidbit. One promotional stunt involved dropping leaflets over colonial towns, boasting of modern air power. Locals reportedly gathered in fascination as paper fluttered down like snow, while skeptical officials muttered that it was an expensive way to deliver junk mail. You can almost imagine a villager catching one, glancing at the fancy logo, and using it as kindling without a second thought. Historians still argue whether these colonial airship ventures were serious strategies or mostly propaganda. Were dirigibles genuinely intended to connect far-flung territories, or were they aerial billboards of power meant to impress both colonizers and colonized? Some scholars point to logistical maps and investment. Others dismiss them as fragile fantasies, unsuited for harsh climates and unstable politics. You let the debate drift like the heat haze rising from the desert below. The sensory details here are stark. The gondola feels hotter, the air dry and tinged with the faint smell of dust carried up from the Sahara. Through the open windows, you hear the drone of insects rising from jungle patches when the engines throttle down. Inside, passengers fan themselves with newspapers, while stewards pour lukewarm water into tin cups, the condensation vanishing almost instantly. The horizon blurs in waves, and the dirigible's shadow crawls across dunes like a wandering whale. Here's your gentle joke. You imagine a colonial officer riding home proudly. "We have brought the future to the desert." His wife writes back, "Splendid, darling, did the future bring an umbrella?" As the dirigible continues, you realize how peculiar this routine of walking speed travel must have looked from below. To the passengers, it was luxury and vision. To those watching from villages and plantations, it was a slow-moving curiosity, equal parts marvel and absurdity. The empire's ambitions floated just as precariously as the hydrogen envelope above your head, grand, gleaming, and perhaps doomed to drift away on the next strong wind. The gondola hums steadily, and yet a new sound drifts into your awareness, a higher, sharper buzz. You glance out the window and squint. There, darting across the sky like a dragonfly, is an aeroplane. Its wings tremble with each gust, its engine sputters, but the speed is undeniable. In a few seconds, it slices past the lumbering dirigible, leaving the gondola passengers staring in mingled admiration and unease. The rivals of the clouds have arrived. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1910s and 1920s, heavier-than aircraft began outpacing dirigibles in speed and efficiency. While airships could carry more people and offer comfort, airplanes quickly became faster, cheaper, and more adaptable. By the late 1920s, schedules shifted to favor airplanes for urgent business travel, while dirigibles clung to their niche as floating salons for those who valued comfort over time. You watch the pilot of the passing biplane tip his cap, grinning through his goggles before vanishing into the horizon. Inside the gondola, a passenger mutters that it's terribly noisy, another insists it will never catch on, while a third sighs dreamily that speed is the future. The lamplight flickers across their faces, and you realize you're watching not just two machines but two philosophies in collision, gliding comfort versus hurrying progress. Here's the quirky tidbit: some passengers on dirigibles mocked airplanes as aerial motorbikes, insisting they were far too rough for ladies and gentlemen. One wit claimed he'd sooner nap inside a wasp's nest than in an aeroplane cabin. Yet within a decade, those same critics were buying plane tickets, grumbling perhaps, but unable to resist the lure of time saved. Historians still argue whether dirigibles might have survived longer if not for airplanes' rapid improvement. Were airships doomed from the start, or could they have remained as luxury liners in the sky had disasters and costs not piled up? Some scholars blame technology, others economics, still others mere fashion. You watch the airplane fade into the distance and think, perhaps dirigibles were simply too slow for a century that had decided never to pause again. The sensory contrast is striking. The biplane's engine is a snarl against the dirigible's purr. Its path is jerky, aggressive, while your gondola drifts smooth and dignified. The air smells of faint exhaust carried back by the wind, stinging compared to the softer scent of lamp oil and bouillon inside. Passengers crane their necks, eyes wide, as though they've glimpsed a comet, a sign that the sky has more than one future. And here's your gentle joke. Imagine a smug dirigible passenger scribbling in his diary, "The poor fellow in that aeroplane must eat dust for breakfast." 10 years later, his grandson writes the opposite. "The poor fellow in that dirigible must eat soup for eternity." The gondola returns to its calm rhythm, stewards clearing plates and folding napkins, but the air feels different now. Everyone has seen the rival, everyone knows the choice is looming: drift in comfort or dash in speed. For the moment, though, the dirigible continues as it always has, slow, stately, and oddly soothing, carrying you forward at walking pace while the future races ahead. The dirigible hums forward, steady again after the fleeting encounter with its rival. By now, you realize these flights were never just about transportation, they were about spectacle. Every takeoff, every docking, every glide across a capital city turned into an event. To ride in a dirigible was not only to travel but to be seen traveling, wrapped in a cloud of prestige and novelty. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the early 20th century, journalists and celebrities flocked to airship flights. Newspapers breathlessly covered departures, often listing the names of passengers as if reporting on a gala. Royalty and wealthy industrialists boarded gondolas alongside reporters who scribbled glowing accounts of palaces in the sky. Each journey became both news item and advertisement, feeding the dirigible's aura of exclusivity. You picture the scene as your gondola approaches a city. Crowds gather below, craning their necks, waving hats and handkerchiefs. Bands sometimes played on rooftops, celebrating the arrival of an airship as if it were a conquering hero. Passengers, peering down, waved in return, suddenly transformed into minor celebrities simply for having purchased a ticket. It was as if stepping into a dirigible also meant stepping onto a stage. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some airship companies even offered binoculars in the gondola, so passengers could gaze down and see themselves being gazed at. One journalist described the odd pleasure of recognizing his own face drawn in caricature by a street artist as he floated overhead. Imagine sipping bouillon while realizing you're someone's cartoon subject below. Historians still argue whether this celebrity status helped or hurt dirigibles. Did the glamour cement them as icons of modernity, or did the constant need for spectacle make them impractical in the long run? Some say the publicity kept them afloat longer than economics allowed. Others insist the aura of fame was their greatest achievement, regardless of practicality. The sensory details of this spectacle are vivid. The gondola windows rattle with the sound of cheering crowds below. You catch the faint brassy notes of a marching band carried up on the wind. Flashbulbs pop as journalists on rooftops aim cameras skyward, each click a frozen moment of awe. Inside, passengers smooth their coats, adjust hats, and stand a little straighter, savoring the knowledge that hundreds of eyes are watching them float by. And here's your gentle joke. Imagine a modest clerk returning home after a flight. His neighbor gasps. "We saw you from the street. You looked so grand." He shrugs and mutters. "Yes, but my tea was cold." As the dirigible docks at its mooring mast, you feel the peculiar thrill of theater. Ropes tossed, crews scrambling, onlookers applauding. Stepping onto the gangway, you're not just a traveler but part of a grand performance, a story retold in newspapers, sketches, and gossip. The dirigible may move at walking speed, but its reputation races ahead, carried on headlines and whispered with admiration in cafes across the city. By now, you've drifted across so many towns and fields that the idea of the dirigible as a novelty fades, and yet its greatest feats still lie ahead. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, these giants of the sky stretched their ambitions beyond short routes and publicity stunts. They undertook voyages so long, so audacious, that they felt like rewriting the map itself. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Graf Zeppelin completed record-setting journeys, including a 21-day circumnavigation of the globe in 1929. Passengers wrote letters postmarked, "On board," ate meals above Siberia, and watched sunrises over the Pacific. The voyages proved that airships could connect continents in a way no train or ship could match. Each crossing was hailed as triumph, even as costs soared and the pace lagged behind new airplanes. You lean against the gondola rail, imagining days stretching into weeks above oceans. The engines hum without pause, the gas bags groan with changing pressure, and stewards carry trays through cabins where time feels elastic. Outside, endless seas roll beneath, dotted occasionally with ships that look like toys. The dirigible's slow progress makes the planet feel both vast and intimate, a globe stitched together by drifting patience. Here's the quirky tidbit. During the Graf Zeppelin's world tour, passengers organized bridge tournaments, poetry readings, and even mock horse races using paper cutouts that wobbled across tables with each sway of the gondola. Newspapers delighted in these reports, leisure itself seemed suspended in midair. Imagine explaining to your friends that you lost a bridge hand somewhere above Siberia. Historians still argue whether these long crossings were genuine milestones in global connectivity or extravagant gestures meant to prove dirigibles' worth one last time. Some hail the circumnavigation as visionary, others dismiss it as a farewell performance before airplanes seize the future. You sip your imaginary bouillon and wonder whether the truth is both, that airships lived most vividly in moments where they seemed both triumphant and obsolete at once. The sensory weight of these journeys is heavy. The air in the gondola grows stale after weeks aloft, tinged with lamp oil and meals reheated too many times. The engines throb ceaselessly, a lull that blurs days together. Yet there are breathtaking instants, dawn over the Pacific, when light gilds the horizon and the gondola windows glow like stained glass, or twilight over jungles, when the sky hums with unseen insects, and the shadow of the airship floats across an entire canopy. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger keeping a diary that reads, "Day 11 still floating. Day 12 still floating. Day 13 bouillon again." By day 14, perhaps the diary itself begins to drift into sleep. As the dirigible nears the end of one of these record crossings, cheers break out, bands play, and journalists scramble for copy. Yet behind the triumphant headlines lurks a quieter truth. Each grand journey is harder to finance, each crossing more precarious as airplanes prove themselves. The dirigible lingers, dignified but endangered, drifting slowly toward the edge of its age. The engines hum one last time as the dirigible tilts gently downward, angling toward its mooring mast. Below, crowds cluster on the field, their hats tilted back, hands shielding eyes, waiting for the floating giant to come to rest. Ropes unfurl like serpents, crewmen on the ground sprint to catch them, and shouts echo as the gondola creaks closer to earth. You lean against the window, watching the slow choreography of docking, the peculiar ballet that closes every journey. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mooring masts became the signature structures of the airship age. Tall towers, sometimes built atop skyscrapers, allowed dirigibles to tether without sprawling landing fields. The Empire State Building in New York famously carried a mast, though attempts to dock there proved impractical. buffeted by winds. Most operations were simpler fields where ground crews wrestled ropes, guiding the giants into place. The gondola shudders softly as ropes tighten. Passengers gather their belongings, adjusting coats and hats, ready to step back into ordinary time. For a moment, though, they linger, reluctant to leave the hush of wicker seats and slow horizons. Outside, the brass rails gleam in the morning light, and you hear the faint sigh of valves releasing gas, like a final exhalation of the voyage. Here's the quirky tidbit. At some landings, champagne was offered to passengers as they stepped down, while locals sold souvenirs shaped like miniature balloons. Children often raced to snatch rope ends, claiming scraps as tokens from the sky. One journalist joked that dirigibles left behind a trail of corks and confetti as surely as they did exhaust. Historians still argue whether these last grand descents were endings or beginnings. Did the spectacle of mooring prove the dirigible's place in modern travel, or were these ceremonies merely the curtain calls of a fading age? Some claim they symbolized progress reaching toward permanence. Others see them as final sighs before airplanes claimed the future. The sensory experience of docking is vivid. The air smells of damp grass and kerosene, the ground a patchwork of mud churned by crew boots. The dirigible's canvas groans as it flexes against the wind, ropes snapping taut in the hands of sweating men below. The gondola's door creaks open, and cool air rushes in, carrying the scent of earth after days of varnish and lamp oil. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a weary passenger stepping down at last, muttering, "We traveled 600 miles in 3 days." His friend pats his back and replies, "Cheer up, you beat the cows this time." As the dirigible finally settles, you step onto the gangway, turning back for one last look. The vast gas bag towers above you, majestic and awkward, shimmering with the promise of an age that believed travel could be slow and still luxurious. Soon, it will fade, overtaken by speed, cost, and tragedy. But for this moment, as ropes tighten and the engines fall silent, you carry the peculiar memory of drifting at walking pace in a palace of wicker and brass. The journey is over now. The dirigible rests, its engines stilled, its ropes tied fast, and the last passengers stepping quietly onto solid ground. You linger, though, still feeling the gentle sway in your body, as though part of you remains aloft, suspended in that cloud of slow-moving calm. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the gondola again, the wicker chairs, the steady hum, the world slipping by at the speed of a stroll. Imagine the faint rattle of porcelain cups, the creak of ropes above, the warm glow of lanterns swaying with each breath of air. All of it has faded into memory, yet it stays with you, soft as a lullaby. Let your shoulders sink into stillness. Let your breath lengthen, like the measured rhythm of propellers cutting gently through the night. Each inhale, each exhale, is another mile of sky behind you. You've crossed continents in unhurried peace, and now you arrive at rest. The debates, the rivalries, the storms, all of it falls away. What lingers is the peculiar gift of slowness, the reminder that not all journeys must hurry, that some exist only to soothe and stretch time. The dirigible fades into history, but its lull remains, wrapping around you like a blanket of air. So drift now calmly, as though you too are held aloft. Let the hum fade, let the ground steady beneath you, and let yourself sink into dreams. You are safe, carried, and already floating into sleep.